Money whispers, but true wealth remains entirely silent. In the polished mahogany-lined cabin of a $65 million Gulfstream, G800 appearances heavily deceive the untrained eye. When a veteran flight attendant looked at the exhausted black woman in a faded hoodie, she saw an interloper. She completely missed the sole owner of the aircraft. That single blinding error in judgment led to a slap echoing through corporate aviation history. Rain lashed against the pristine tarmac of Teterboro Airport, blurring the bright runway lights into smeared streaks of neon. Parked just outside the signature flight support terminal sat a brand-new Gulfstream G800, its sleek aerodynamic fuselage gleaming under the floodlights. Inside the cabin, Barbara Roberts was meticulously adjusting a crystal vase of white orchids. At 52, Barbara considered herself a connoisseur of the elite. Having spent over 2 decades serving Russian oligarchs, Wall Street titans, and European royalty, she possessed a rigid, deeply ingrained taxonomy of wealth. In her mind, billionaires spoke and demanded things in a very specific, recognizable manner. They wore loro piana, carried themselves with an air of impatient authority, and never, under any circumstances, carried their own luggage. Barbara smoothed the lapels of her tailored navy blue uniform, a bespoke piece provided by Apex Aviation Management. Tonight's flight was destined for London Heathrow, a transatlantic red-eye. The passenger manifest had been somewhat confusing. The aircraft was privately owned by a shell corporation named Zephyr Holdings, a fact Barbara barely registered as she worked for the management company that maintained and staffed the jet. The manifest listed 2 passengers, a Mr. Richard Harrington and a C. Hawthorne. Apex Management had informed Barbara that there was a unique arrangement for this flight. A corporate client, Harrington had been granted a seat on the jet due to a scheduling conflict with another charter, approved as a courtesy by the aircraft's mysterious owner, who was also flying. Barbara, applying her usual prejudices, immediately assumed that Richard Harrington, a middle-aged, silver-haired white man holding a VP title at a logistics firm, was the primary charter client, perhaps even the CEO of Zephyr Holdings. The second name, C. Hawthorne, was listed with 0 corporate titles or special catering requests. Barbara naturally assumed this C. Hawthorne was either a low-level assistant, an administrative tag-along, or perhaps a junior associate lucky enough to catch a ride on the boss's dime. Richard Harrington boarded first. He stepped out of a chauffeured Mercedes S-Class, wearing a sharp, albeit slightly flashy Tom Ford suit. He carried a leather briefcase and an aura of unmistakable loud entitlement. Harrington was in reality a mid-level regional vice president who had essentially won this private flight as a corporate incentive bonus. However, stepping onto the $65 million aircraft, the intoxicating scent of fine leather and polished wood went straight to his head. He decided in that moment to play the part of the billionaire he desperately wished he was. "Good evening, Mr. Harrington," Barbara greeted him warmly, dipping her head in a practiced show of deference. "Welcome aboard. We have your preferred vintage of Dom Perignon chilling, and the chef has prepared the Wagyu sliders you requested." "Excellent, Barbara. Excellent," Harrington replied, his voice booming through the quiet cabin as he tossed his briefcase onto one of the plush, cream-colored leather divans in the main lounge area. "I expect a smooth flight. I have crucial meetings in the city tomorrow." "Of course, sir. Captain Ridge assures us the weather over the Atlantic is perfectly clear." Barbara smiled, already pouring him a glass of champagne. She was entirely in her element, serving a man who fit her exact mental mold of an important person. 10 minutes later, a heavily tinted, nondescript black SUV pulled up to the aircraft steps. There was no chauffeur rushing to open the door with an umbrella. Instead, the rear door pushed open, and Charlotte Hawthorne stepped out into the biting drizzle. Charlotte was 34 years old, brilliant and completely exhausted. She was the architect of a revolutionary cloud security infrastructure that she had recently sold to a major tech conglomerate for $4 billion. Following the buyout, she had established her own private equity firm, Zephyr Holdings. She had purchased this Gulfstream G800 outright just 3 weeks ago to facilitate her grueling international schedule. She had spent the last 48 hours locked in a windowless boardroom in Manhattan, surviving on black coffee and sheer willpower, finalizing a hostile takeover of a struggling European tech firm. She did not look like a billionaire. Charlotte was dressed in a pair of faded, comfortable Yale sweatpants, a well-worn, oversized grey hoodie, and a pair of scuffed white sneakers. Her natural hair was pulled back into a messy puff, and she carried a battered, sticker-covered canvas backpack that housed her laptop, the very laptop containing source code worth more than the entire gross domestic product of a small island nation. Trudging up the air stairs, Charlotte just wanted to sleep. She longed for the custom-designed stateroom at the rear of the aircraft, the one she had specifically requested be outfitted with a California king-sized mattress and blackout panels. As Charlotte stepped into the brightly lit galley, Barbara physically blocked her path. The flight attendant's warm, professional smile vanished, replaced by a tight, scrutinizing mask of polite disdain. "Excuse me," Barbara said, her tone sharp and loud, pitching her voice as if speaking to someone who didn't quite understand English. "The catering and ground crew entrance is toward the rear, though we are already fully stocked." Charlotte blinked, wiping a drop of rain from her forehead. She looked at Barbara, slightly confused. "I'm not catering. I'm flying." Barbara's eyes dropped to Charlotte's faded sweatpants, then to the scuffed sneakers. Her posture stiffened. "I see. You must be C. Hawthorne, Mr. Harrington's associate." Charlotte hesitated. The management company had called her yesterday, asking if she would mind allowing a stranded charter client to hitch a ride to London on her jet, as he was desperate and no other planes were available. Charlotte, being pragmatic and relatively kind-hearted, had agreed, stipulating only that the man stay out of her way. She hadn't bothered to learn his name. "I suppose," Charlotte muttered, too tired to correct the flight attendant's assumption about who belonged to whom. "I'm Charlotte Hawthorne. I just need to get to my seat." "Right," Barbara said briskly, stepping aside but pointing sharply toward the very front of the aircraft near the galley, where a small, cramped club seat was located, typically used for personal assistance or security detail. "You can stow your backpack under that seat there. Please do so quickly. Mr. Harrington is already relaxing in the main cabin, and we don't want to disturb his peace before takeoff." Charlotte frowned. She looked past Barbara into the luxurious main cabin. Richard Harrington was sprawled across the primary divan, a crystal flute of champagne in his hand, laughing loudly at something on his phone. Beyond him, through a set of sliding mahogany doors, was the VIP stateroom, her stateroom. "I won't be sitting there," Charlotte said quietly, her voice smooth, but carrying a subtle weight. "I'll be in the aft stateroom." Barbara's eyes widened in genuine shock, followed immediately by defensive anger. "Absolutely not." The flight attendant snapped her voice, dropping to a harsh whisper to avoid alerting Harrington. "That area is strictly reserved for the principal passenger. Mr. Harrington has not indicated that you are allowed to use the VIP quarters. You will sit where I have directed you, Miss Hawthorne, or you will not be flying with us tonight." Charlotte stared at the woman. The sheer audacity of the demand momentarily pierced through her exhaustion. She could have ended the charade right then and there. She could have pulled up the tail number registration on her phone or called the CEO of Apex Aviation. But a lifetime of being underestimated, of walking into boardrooms and being mistaken for the secretary had forged a deep, cynical patience within her. She was curious to see just how far this would go, and frankly, she was too tired to argue logistics with a flight attendant. The aft stateroom. Charlotte repeated her tone, dropping an octave devoid of any warmth. Now, move out of my way. Before Barbara could summon another retort, Captain Thomas Ridge stepped out of the cockpit, a clipboard in hand. Everything secure back here. Barbara ATC just gave us our window. We need to push back in 5. Barbara quickly composed her face into a professional smile. Yes, Captain. Just getting the associate settled. She shot Charlotte a venomous glare. Right this way, Miss Hawthorne. Deciding to temporarily retreat to avoid delaying her own flight, Charlotte bypassed the tiny assistant seat, but compromised by taking a single club seat in the mid-cabin, just behind Harrington's sprawling setup, rather than fighting her way to the bedroom while the plane was taxiing. She dropped her heavy backpack onto the leather seat next to her, pulling out her laptop. As the twin Rolls-Royce engines roared to life, vibrating through the floorboards, Barbara marched up to Charlotte, leaning down aggressively. "Do not think this conversation is over," she hissed. "When we are airborne, you will follow my instructions, or I will have the captain restrain you for insubordination." Charlotte simply opened her laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating her unamused face. She didn't say a word. She just began to type. The Gulfstream G800 sliced through the heavy rain clouds, bursting into the calm, star-studded stratosphere above the Atlantic Ocean. Inside the cabin, the seatbelt sign chimed off with a soft, melodic ping. The environment was meticulously engineered to maintain a sea-level cabin pressure, ensuring the passengers felt no fatigue. Yet the atmosphere inside the aircraft was suffocatingly tense. In the forward lounge area, Richard Harrington was living out a fantasy. He had already consumed 2 glasses of vintage champagne and was now demanding a specific brand of scotch that he claimed he always drank when flying private. Barbara practically tripped over herself to accommodate him, fetching a bottle of Macallan 25 and serving it in a heavy Baccarat crystal tumbler. "You know, Barbara," Harrington slurred slightly, leaning back and resting his Italian leather shoes directly onto the pristine white upholstery of the opposite seat. "It's so hard to find good staff these days. My company, we pride ourselves on excellence. It's why I only fly with Apex." He had never flown with Apex before in his life. "We are honored by your loyalty, Mr. Harrington," Barbara crooned, offering him a warm, scented towel on a silver tray. "Is the cabin temperature to your liking? Should I dim the ambient lighting?" "Actually, yes," Harrington said, suddenly squinting toward the mid-cabin. "It's a bit bright. And what is that incessant clicking noise?" Both of them turned to look at Charlotte. She was completely absorbed in her work, her fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard of her laptop. She was reviewing the final integration protocols for the European firm she had just acquired. The stakes were in the hundreds of millions, and her concentration was absolute. The soft, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of her typing was the only sound competing with the gentle hum of the jet engines. Barbara's jaw tightened. She saw an opportunity to demonstrate her exceptional service to the man she believed was signing her paycheck, while simultaneously putting the arrogant, underdressed woman in her place. "I sincerely apologize, Mr. Harrington," Barbara murmured soothingly. "I will handle the disturbance immediately." Barbara marched down the carpeted aisle, her heels sinking into the plush wool. She stopped next to Charlotte's seat, towering over the younger woman. Charlotte didn't look up, her eyes scanning lines of Python code. "Miss Hawthorne," Barbara said, her voice dripping with condescension. Charlotte held up a single index finger, a universal gesture for, "Give me a second." She finished compiling a block of code, hit execute, and finally looked up. "Yes. Your typing is disturbing the principal passenger." Barbara stated coldly. Furthermore, the screen brightness is interfering with the cabin's ambient lighting profile. I need you to close the laptop. Charlotte stared at her, genuinely baffled by the sheer audacity. I'm working. And this is a quiet keyboard. If Mr. Harrington has sensitive hearing, perhaps you can offer him some noise-cancelling headphones. I believe there are several pairs of Bose headphones in the credenza behind you. She knew exactly where they were, because she had personally selected the interior outfitting of the jet. Barbara flushed a dark, angry red creeping up her neck. She was not used to being spoken to this way, especially not by someone wearing a faded hoodie on a luxury aircraft. You do not give me orders, Barbara hissed, leaning closer. You are a guest on this aircraft, a subordinate. Mr. Harrington has graciously allowed you to accompany him, and you will show the proper respect. Close the laptop. Now. Charlotte's expression hardened. The amusement she had felt on the tarmac had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical anger. She closed the laptop with a soft snap, but she didn't put it away. She rested her hands on top of the brushed aluminum casing. Let's get something straight, Barbara, Charlotte said, reading the name tag pinned to the woman's uniform. Her voice was remarkably calm, the tone of a woman used to commanding rooms filled with aggressive, powerful men. I am not Mr. Harrington's subordinate. I am not his guest. And if anyone is going to dictate the lighting and sound profile of this cabin, it is going to be me. Now I have extremely important work to finish, so I suggest you return to the galley and find something useful to do. Barbara was momentarily stunned into silence. The sheer authority in Charlotte's voice conflicted violently with her visual assessment of the woman. For a split second, doubt flickered in Barbara's mind. Could she be a high-ranking executive, a vital consultant? But Barbara looked again at the scuffed sneakers and the unruly hair. Her prejudice roared back to life louder than before. No, this woman was just arrogant, a diversity hire who forgot her place, or a spoiled assistant trying to flex non-existent muscle. Before Barbara could retaliate, Harrington's voice boomed from the front. Barbara, what's the hold-up? I'm trying to relax here, and she's being belligerent. I thought I chartered a private jet, not a commercial bus. Harrington, emboldened by the alcohol and Barbara's subservience, stood up and walked toward them. He looked Charlotte up and down, his lip curling into a sneer. Look, miss, I don't know who in HR approved you catching a ride on my charter, but I am trying to prepare for a multi-million-dollar pitch. I need peace and quiet. If you can't respect that, I'll have the pilot land this bird in Gander and kick you to the curb. Charlotte slowly stood up. She was not a tall woman, barely 5'4", but the sheer force of her presence seemed to suck the oxygen out of the cabin. She looked directly into Harrington's eyes. Your charter? Charlotte asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Yes, my charter. Harrington lied smoothly, puffing out his chest. He assumed the management company had arranged this, and that this woman would have no way of knowing the intricate financial details of the flight. My company paid top dollar for this jet. So I suggest you sit down, shut your mouth, and stop acting like you own the place. Charlotte let out a short, dry laugh. It was a sound devoid of any humor. She looked from Harrington's flushed, arrogant face to Barbara's smug, vindictive expression. They had formed a unified front of entitlement and bigotry, completely oblivious to the reality of the ground beneath their feet. This is fascinating, Charlotte murmured almost to herself. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her smartphone. What are you doing? Barbara demanded, sharply stepping forward. I am calling Thomas the captain, Charlotte said evenly. And then I am calling the CEO of Apex Aviation. We're going to clear up this little misunderstanding right now. Panic flashed in Barbara's eyes. If this woman actually complained to the captain or the management company, there would be a massive inquiry. Even if Charlotte was just an assistant, creating a hostile environment on a flight was grounds for termination. Barbara needed to maintain control. She needed to shut this down before it escalated beyond the cabin. "You will do no such thing," Barbara snapped. "Watch me," Charlotte replied, dialing the internal interphone number that connected directly to the cockpit. The digital display on the cabin bulkhead indicated they were 38,000 feet over the churning black expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. Inside the pressurized tube of luxury, the social contract was rapidly disintegrating. As Charlotte pressed the call button on her phone, Barbara's professional facade completely shattered. Years of unchecked authority over junior stews and catering staff, combined with her absolute certainty that she was protecting a high-value client from a belligerent nobody, overrode all her training. "I said put the phone down," Barbara barked. She lunged forward, her hand shooting out to grab the device from Charlotte's grasp. Charlotte, possessing the quick reflexes of someone who had survived years of intense, high-pressure environments, instinctively yanked her hand back and stepped aside. "Do not touch me," she warned, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You are crossing a line you cannot uncross." "You are a security risk," Harrington shouted from the aisle, playing the role of the outraged VIP to the hilt. "Barbara, she's unhinged. Restrain her." Encouraged by Harrington's validation, Barbara felt a surge of righteous fury. This disrespectful, poorly dressed woman was defying her, humiliating her in front of a billionaire client, and threatening her job. The flight attendant's vision narrowed. She saw red. "You insolent little—" Barbara snarled. She swung her arm. It wasn't a gentle attempt to grab the phone this time. It was a full-force, open-handed strike, fueled by adrenaline panic and deeply rooted prejudice. Crack. The sound of the slap was shockingly loud, a sharp, violent retort that seemed to echo off the polished mahogany bulkheads and the crystal glassware. For 3 agonizing seconds, there was absolute deathly silence in the cabin. The soft hum of the Rolls-Royce engines seemed to fade into the background. Charlotte stood frozen, her head turned slightly to the side from the impact. A stark, angry red handprint was rapidly blooming across her left cheek. She didn't drop her phone. She didn't cry out. She just slowly turned her head back to face Barbara. Her dark eyes, previously filled with cold annoyance, were now completely dead, resembling black ice. Barbara stood, panting, her hand still raised slightly in the air. A sudden, sickening wave of realization washed over her. The physical sting of hitting someone broke through the haze of her anger. She had just struck a passenger. Regardless of who the passenger was, it was an unforgivable career-ending offense in the world of private aviation. She stumbled backward, her hand dropping to her side, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Harrington, who had been loudly cheering on the confrontation just seconds before, suddenly looked pale. He took a step back, the alcohol instantly burning off in his veins. He was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid enough to want to be involved in a physical assault at 40,000 feet. "Jesus, Barbara," he muttered quickly, retreating to his seat and picking up his glass, trying to pretend he had nothing to do with what just happened. Charlotte touched 2 fingers to her stinging cheek. She looked at the tips of her fingers, then back at Barbara. "You hit me," Charlotte stated. It wasn't a question. It was a chilling confirmation of a new reality. You were being aggressive," Barbara stammered, her voice trembling violently. She tried to rebuild her wall of authority, but her foundation had crumbled. "You refuse to comply with crew instructions. You are a danger to the flight." "I am typing on a laptop," Charlotte replied, her voice so devoid of emotion it was terrifying. "And you committed battery." Before Barbara could formulate another excuse, the heavy reinforced door to the cockpit swung open. Captain Thomas Ridge stepped out. The interphone call Charlotte had initiated had connected just seconds before the slap. The captain hadn't heard the physical blow, but he had heard the shouting, and the abrupt silence that followed had triggered his internal alarms. Captain Ridge was a veteran aviator, a former Air Force pilot who commanded respect through calm authority rather than volume. He took one look at the scene. Barbara pale and shaking Harrington cowering in his seat, and Charlotte Hawthorne standing perfectly still, a vivid red mark blazing on her face. "What the hell is going on back here?" Captain Ridge demanded, his sharp gaze cutting through the tension. Barbara practically threw herself toward the captain, desperate to control the narrative. "Captain Ridge, thank God. This passenger Hawthorne, she became belligerent. She refused to obey safety instructions. She was harassing Mr. Harrington. And then she lunged at me. I had to defend myself." Harrington, seeing an opportunity to distance himself from the assault while still playing the victim, chimed in. "It's true, Captain. The woman is unhinged. She's been nothing but trouble since she boarded." Captain Ridge frowned, his hand resting instinctively on the emergency restraint zip ties clipped to his belt. He turned to look at Charlotte, expecting a hysterical defense or a violent outburst. Instead, Charlotte calmly lifted her phone. The screen was still illuminated. "Captain Ridge," she said, her voice steady and clear. "My name is Charlotte Hawthorne. I am the founder and sole managing partner of Zephyr Holdings." Barbara scoffed loudly, a sound of desperate hysterical disbelief. "Don't listen to her, Captain." "She's lying. She's just an assistant. Mr. Harrington is the charter client." Captain Ridge didn't look at Barbara. He kept his eyes locked on Charlotte. As a senior pilot for Apex, he was privy to information that the cabin crew was not. He knew the aircraft was owned by Zephyr Holdings. He also knew that the COO of Apex Aviation had personally called him 3 hours before the flight to inform him that the ultimate beneficial owner of Zephyr Holdings, Miss Charlotte Hawthorne, would be flying with them tonight, and that her comfort was the highest priority of the company. The color completely drained from Captain Ridge's face. He looked at the red handprint on Charlotte's cheek. He looked at Barbara, who was still glaring at Charlotte with venomous triumph. "Barbara," Captain Ridge said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous gravel. "Do you have any idea what you have just done?" "I restrained an unruly subordinate." Barbara insisted, her voice shrill with panic. "She is not a subordinate," Captain Ridge said, his words falling like heavy stones in the quiet cabin. He turned fully to face the flight attendant, his eyes burning with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "Ms. Hawthorne is not an assistant. She is not a guest." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. He gestured sharply to the luxurious leather seats, the polished mahogany, the crystal glassware, and the very floor beneath their feet. "Ms. Hawthorne," the captain stated with brutal, absolute clarity, "owns this airplane." Silence suffocated the cabin. It was not a peaceful quiet, but the heavy, pressurized stillness that follows a bomb detonation before the shockwave hits. The soft amber glow of the ambient lighting reflected off the polished mahogany bulkheads, highlighting the stark red handprint glowing furiously on Charlotte Hawthorne's cheek. Reality fractured within Barbara Roberts's mind. She stared at the faded grey Yale hoodie, the scuffed white sneakers and the messy hair. Her brain, rigidly wired to associate power exclusively with tailored Tom Ford suits and diamond-encrusted Patek Philippe watches, simply rejected Captain Ridge's words. It was a cognitive glitch. It had to be a mistake. "Captain, you are misinformed?" Barbara stammered, her voice a thin, reedy squeak that barely carried over the hum of the Rolls-Royce engines. She backed away slightly, her hands trembling as she smoothed her bespoke Apex Aviation uniform in a desperate subconscious bid to regain her professional armor. This woman is an associate, Mr. Harrington's associate. Look at her. The management company must have given you the wrong briefing profile." Captain Ridge did not move. His posture remained rigidly military, a remnant of his days flying C-17 Globemasters. "Barbara, I spoke directly with William Stanhope, the CEO of Apex Aviation Management, 3 hours prior to Wheels Up. He personally forwarded me the tail registry documents and the corporate ownership structure of Zephyr Holdings. Ms. Hawthorne is the sole managing partner. She purchased this Gulfstream G800 outright on the 14th of this month. Her routing priority overrides everything. You have just committed physical battery against the owner of the aircraft you are currently standing in." The words battery and owner finally pierced through the flight attendant's thick shell of prejudice. All the blood drained from Barbara's face, leaving her pale and sickly under the cabin lights. Her knees visibly buckled. The realization did not arrive like a gentle wave, but like a violent, crushing avalanche. She hadn't just insulted a passenger. She had physically assaulted a high-net-worth individual who possessed the financial firepower to destroy her life with a single phone call. In the ultra-exclusive, closely knit world of private aviation, where discretion and obsequious service were the only currencies that mattered, a flight attendant striking a billionaire client was not just a firing offense. It was a career-ending, industry-wide blacklisting event. She would never step foot on a private tarmac again. Harrington, watching the scene unfold from the edge of the cream-colored divan, experienced his own terrifying revelation. The warm, intoxicating buzz of the vintage Macallan Scotch evaporated from his bloodstream, replaced by the icy chill of absolute panic. He was a mid-level regional vice president at Vanguard Global Logistics. His presence on this flight was a fluke, a desperate favor called in by his company's travel department to get him to a critical pitch meeting after commercial flights were grounded. He had spent the last hours treating the actual owner of the $65 million jet like dirt on his shoe, actively encouraging her assault. "Ms. Hawthorne." Harrington interjected his voice, dripping with sudden, desperate sycophancy. He stood up awkwardly, attempting to bow his head. I had no idea. I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding. I assure you I tried to tell the flight attendant to leave you in peace. Her behavior is completely unacceptable and unhinged. You should press charges immediately." Charlotte finally shifted her gaze. She looked away from the trembling flight attendant and locked eyes with Harrington. Her expression remained chillingly blank. She reached out, picked up the Baccarat crystal tumbler sitting on the console next to her, and examined the amber liquid inside. "You told her to leave me in peace." Charlotte repeated, her tone smooth and devoid of any fluctuation. "That is a fascinating revision of history, Mr. Harrington. 10 minutes ago you threatened to have me kicked to the curb in Gander because my typing was interrupting your fantasy of being a titan of industry. You demanded she restrain me." Harrington swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I was startled. It was a stressful boarding process. I thought you were a stowaway or a confused staff member. It was a terrible mistake in judgment." "It was an illumination of your character," Charlotte corrected him softly. She set the crystal tumbler down with a sharp clink. "You borrowed a sliver of power today, and the very first thing you did with it was attempt to crush someone you deemed beneath you. Vanguard Global Logistics must be thrilled to have such a visionary representing them in London tomorrow." Harrington's breath hitched. Vanguard Global Logistics. She knew who he worked for. The realization that this woman who had been quietly typing on her laptop possessed access to his entire professional profile was terrifying. If she called his CEO, David Carmichael, and relayed this incident, his career would be over before the plane even crossed the Greenwich Meridian. "Please, Miss Hawthorne Harrington," begged, completely abandoning any pretense of dignity. "My career is on the line with this pitch. I am a father. I was just trying to focus." Charlotte ignored him entirely, turning her attention back to Captain Ridge. "Thomas." "Yes, ma'am," the captain responded instantly. "What is our current ETA to London?" "Heathrow." "Approximately 4 hours and 20 minutes, ma'am. We have clearance for a direct routing." "Maintain the flight plan," Charlotte instructed calmly. She lifted her hand and pointed a single steady finger at Barbara, who was now openly weeping silent tears, cutting tracks through her immaculate makeup. Under Federal Aviation Administration statutes, and according to Apex Aviation's internal security protocols, an unprovoked physical assault by a crew member constitutes a severe in-flight security threat. "Is that correct, Captain?" "Yes, ma'am." "That is absolutely correct," Captain Ridge affirmed. "Excellent. Then you will formally relieve Miss Roberts of her duties immediately. She is to be confined to the forward jump seat in the galley for the remainder of this flight. She is not to enter the main cabin, she is not to serve any food or beverages, and she is not to speak to me again. If she violates these parameters, you will divert this aircraft to Reykjavik and hand her over to Icelandic authorities for battery." Barbara let out a strangled sob, covering her mouth with both hands. "Please." "Miss Hawthorne, I'll do anything. I've been flying for 20 years. This is my whole life. I thought I was protecting the client." "You were protecting your own ego." Charlotte stated her voice as hard as diamond. "You looked at a black woman in a hoodie and decided against all logic and instruction that she could not possibly belong in your pristine environment. You let your prejudice override your professionalism, and then you let your anger override the law. Proceed to the galley, Barbara. Now." Defeated, humiliated, and utterly broken, Barbara turned and stumbled down the narrow aisle toward the front of the aircraft. She collapsed into the cramped fold-down jump seat, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with violent, silent sobs. Charlotte turned back to Harrington, who was standing frozen in the aisle. "Sit down, Mr. Harrington. Do not speak to me for the rest of this flight. Do not ask for another drink. If you require water, you may fetch it yourself from the forward cooler. If you so much as sigh too loudly, I will have Thomas drop you in a holding cell in Gander." "Am I clear?" "Crystal clear, Miss Hawthorne," Harrington whispered, sinking back into his seat and pulling his knees tightly together, wishing he could evaporate into the luxurious upholstery. Charlotte nodded slowly. She picked up her laptop, her cheek still burning with intense heat. She walked past Harrington without giving him a second glance, slid open the heavy mahogany doors to the aft VIP stateroom, and closed them firmly behind her, leaving the two shattered individuals in the main cabin to stew in the toxic consequences of their own making. The descent into London Heathrow was characterized by the usual turbulent chop of thick grey English cloud cover. Below them, the sprawling, rain-slicked concrete of the city looked cold and unforgiving in the early morning light. Inside the cabin of the Gulfstream G800, the atmosphere had remained in a state of localized cryogenic freeze for 4 straight hours. Harrington had not slept. He had not moved. He simply stared blankly at the bulkhead, agonizing over the inevitable fallout waiting for him on the ground. Up front, Barbara had remained strapped into her jump seat, staring blankly at the stainless steel espresso machine, mourning the violent death of her livelihood. As the aircraft's landing gear deployed with a heavy mechanical thud, the mahogany doors to the aft stateroom finally slid open. Charlotte Hawthorne emerged. The exhaustion that had plagued her during boarding was completely gone. She had slept for 3 hours in the California king bed and taken a hot shower in the ensuite bathroom. She was now dressed in a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal grey Tom Ford power suit, ironically, a much higher tier of tailoring than Harrington's, paired with a crisp white silk blouse. The red mark on her cheek had faded to a dull, bruised purple, which she had not bothered to conceal with makeup. It was a badge of evidence. She looked every inch the apex predator of the corporate world. The jet touched down smoothly on the runway, the thrust reversers roaring to life as Captain Ridge expertly bled off their speed. They taxied away from the commercial terminals, heading straight for the exclusive Harrods Aviation VIP facility, a secure FBO dedicated entirely to heads of state royalty and billionaires. As the jet came to a gentle halt on the private tarmac, the engines whining down to a low hum, Charlotte checked her phone. The Viasat onboard Wi-Fi had allowed her to conduct a significant amount of business, while Harrington sweated in silence. The main cabin door unsealed, and the air stairs hummed as they extended down to the wet pavement. Barbara unbuckled her harness and stood up, her eyes downcast. She moved to assume her usual position at the door, to bid the passengers farewell, a final pathetic attempt at maintaining protocol. "Stay exactly where you are," Charlotte ordered sharply from the aisle. Charlotte walked to the open doorway and looked down at the tarmac. Waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs was a fleet of 3 black Range Rovers. Flanking the vehicles were 4 heavily built men in dark suits with earpieces, her private security detail from Gavin de Becker and Associates. But more importantly, standing just to the side of the vehicles, rain slicking their high-visibility jackets, were 2 uniformed officers of the Metropolitan Police Aviation Policing Command. Barbara, peering over Charlotte's shoulder, saw the police. A sharp gasp escaped her throat. "Captain Ridge," Charlotte called out smoothly. The captain emerged from the cockpit. "Yes, Miss Hawthorne." "You logged the in-flight security incident with air traffic control prior to descent, as per FAA and British Civil Aviation Authority regulations regarding physical assault." "I did, ma'am. The authorities requested we hold the individual on board until they can secure the cabin." "Excellent. You may hand Miss Roberts over to them." Charlotte turned and walked down the air stairs, the cold London air biting at her face. One of her security personnel immediately stepped forward with a large black umbrella shielding her from the drizzle. The lead police officer stepped forward. "Miss Hawthorne, I am Sergeant Miller. We received a report of an assault from the captain." "That is correct, Sergeant," Charlotte said, calmly, pointing to her bruised cheek. "The flight attendant Barbara Roberts struck me across the face, unprovoked during a dispute over seating arrangements. The captain has the cockpit voice recorder data detailing the altercation and my subsequent report. I will have my legal team at Clifford Chance forward a formal statement to your precinct by noon, outlining my intent to press full criminal charges for battery." The sergeant nodded grimly. "Understood, ma'am. We will take her into custody for questioning immediately." As Charlotte spoke, Harrington practically scrambled down the stairs, clutching his leather briefcase like a life preserver. He was desperately trying to slip past the police and the security detail, hoping to jump into a waiting taxi and disappear into the safety of central London. "Mr. Harrington," Charlotte's voice cut through the damp air, freezing him in his tracks. He turned around slowly, a forced, sickly smile plastered on his face. "Miss Hawthorne, a pleasant flight, all things considered. I must be off to my pitch. Vanguard Logistics is counting on me." Charlotte stepped out from under the umbrella, allowing the fine mist to settle on her dark suit. She looked at him with an expression of profound pity mixed with absolute ruthlessness. "There will be no pitch today, Mr. Harrington," she said quietly. Harrington blinked, confused. "I don't understand. I have a 9 a.m. meeting with the Eurofreight Consortium." "You had a 9 a.m. meeting," Charlotte corrected him. She held up her smartphone. "While you were silently panicking over the Atlantic, I utilized the onboard Wi-Fi. I sent a very detailed email to David Carmichael, the CEO of Vanguard Logistics. I outlined your behavior on this flight, your complicity in the assault against me, and your general lack of professional judgment." Harrington's jaw dropped. The color rushed out of his face so fast he looked as though he might faint on the tarmac. You contacted David." "I did. And because Zephyr Holdings recently acquired a 14% controlling stake in Vanguard's primary European supply chain partner, David was extremely motivated to return my email promptly." Charlotte smiled a terrifying shark-like expression. "He asked me to inform you that you are effectively terminated from Vanguard Global Logistics, pending a formal HR review. You have been stripped of your corporate authority. The Eurofreight pitch has been handed off to your junior associate, who is currently dialing into the meeting from New York." Harrington dropped his briefcase. It hit the wet concrete with a dull slap. "No, you can't. My job." "I didn't lose your job, Mr. Harrington," Charlotte said, turning her back on him and walking toward the lead Range Rover. "You threw it away the moment you decided to play king on someone else's throne." Behind her, the Metropolitan Police officers marched up the airstairs to retrieve Barbara Roberts. Harrington stood alone in the rain, a recently unemployed middle-aged man staring at a $65 million jet he would never be allowed near again. Charlotte Hawthorne slid into the plush leather interior of the Range Rover. She pulled out her laptop, opened the screen, and resumed typing. The European integration deal was waiting, and she had a billion-dollar empire to run. News travels through the upper echelons of global finance with the destructive speed of a wildfire. By the time Charlotte Hawthorne's armoured motorcade pulled into the private courtyard of the Rosewood London Hotel in Holborn, Vanguard, Global Logistics was already in a state of absolute unmitigated panic. David Carmichael, the CEO of Vanguard, had spent his entire morning fielding furious calls from his board of directors. Zephyr Holdings was not merely a boutique private equity firm. It was a financial juggernaut, a hyper-aggressive entity that had recently partnered with institutional titans like BlackRock and KKR to restructure global supply chains. When Charlotte's email containing the cockpit voice recorder transcript and the official flight incident report landed in Carmichael's inbox, he did not hesitate. In the high-stakes game of corporate survival, a mid-level regional vice president was nothing more than a sacrificial pawn. Harrington was sitting in the sterile, neon-lit waiting area of a mid-tier commercial hotel near Heathrow, furiously dialing numbers on his smartphone. His corporate Amex had been declined at the front desk of the Savoy just an hour prior. "Listen to me, Jim," Harrington hissed into the phone, speaking to his immediate supervisor back in Chicago. "It was a massive misunderstanding. The flight attendant went crazy. I was just trying to read some quarterly reports. You have to talk to Carmichael. You have to explain, 'Stop talking, Harrington.'" Jim's voice cut through the line, sounding completely exhausted and incredibly distant. "You are radioactive. Skadden Arps is drafting your severance paperwork right now, and they are invoking the morality and gross misconduct clauses. You aren't getting a dime of your unvested stock options, and your pension contributions are being frozen, pending a legal review of your liability in the assault on a major shareholder." Harrington felt the blood rush from his head, his vision tunneling. A major shareholder. Jim, she was wearing sweatpants. She looked like She owns 14% of our European operations. Jim practically screamed through the receiver. "She could liquidate our entire overseas footprint on a whim. Security has already boxed up your office. Do not contact anyone at Vanguard again. All future communications will go through our legal counsel. Goodbye." The line went dead. Harrington stared at his phone, his chest heaving as a cold, suffocating dread settled over him. He tried to call a high-end crisis management firm, the Brunswick Group, hoping to spin the narrative. The moment the receptionist heard his name and ran it against the morning's internal industry alerts, he was placed on a permanent hold. He was completely exiled from the only world he cared about. Meanwhile, a different kind of execution was taking place at the Metropolitan Police Station near the airport. Barbara Roberts sat in a bleak grey interrogation room, shivering in her bespoke navy blue uniform. The adrenaline had completely vanished, leaving behind a hollow, terrifying reality. She had spent 2 decades serving the ultra-wealthy, absorbing their arrogance, believing their proximity to power somehow made her powerful. Now, stripped of the luxurious backdrop of the Gulf Stream cabin, she was just an ordinary citizen facing a devastating criminal charge. The heavy metal door clicked open, and a sharp-featured man in an immaculate grey suit walked in carrying a thin leather briefcase. Barbara's eyes lit up with a desperate, fleeting spark of hope. Are you the lawyer from Apex Management?" she asked, her voice raspy from crying. "Mr. Stanhope sent you to get me out." The man did not smile. He did not offer his hand. He sat down across from her, unclasped his briefcase, and pulled out a single stack of papers. "My name is Arthur Pendleton. I am Senior Legal Counsel for Apex Aviation Management. I am not here to represent you, Ms. Roberts. I am here to formally serve you with your immediate termination papers." Barbara recoiled as if she had been slapped. "What? No. You can't. I was protecting a client. You committed unprovoked physical battery against the sole owner of the aircraft you were contracted to staff." Pendleton stated, his voice a flat, clinical drone. "You violated Federal Aviation Administration codes, British Civil Aviation Authority regulations, and every internal protocol Apex holds. You are an immense liability. As of this exact moment, your security clearances are permanently revoked. Apex is fully cooperating with the Crown Prosecution Service to ensure you face maximum legal penalties, thereby severing our corporate liability regarding your actions." Barbara stared at the papers, the stark black ink blurring through a fresh wave of tears. "Please. My pension. My medical? Forfeited under the gross criminal misconduct clause of your employment contract," Pendleton replied, sliding a pen across the metal table. "Sign the acknowledgement of termination. The police will be transferring you to a holding cell shortly to await your arraignment." Miles away in a gleaming glass-walled boardroom high above Canary Wharf, Charlotte Hawthorne was not thinking about flight attendants or arrogant vice presidents. She stood at the head of a massive mahogany table, flanked by her lead advisors from Goldman Sachs and her legal team from Clifford Chance. She was wearing her charcoal grey Tom Ford suit, the faint purple bruise on her cheek serving as a silent, intimidating testament to her sheer resilience. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the table, locking eyes with the terrified board members of the European tech firm she was absorbing. "The offer is $4.2 billion, Charlotte said, her voice smooth, calm, and utterly devoid of mercy. "It is not a negotiation. It is a lifeline. You have precisely 3 minutes to sign the transfer documents, or I will withdraw the offer, short your stock into oblivion by market open, and buy your remaining assets for scrap by Friday." The CEO of the failing tech firm swallowed hard, looked at the brutal, unyielding expression on Charlotte's face, and picked up his pen. The deal was closed. The empire expanded. The slap on the airplane was nothing more than a microscopic footnote in a day of massive corporate conquest. 3 months later, the aggressive, fast-paced corporate landscape of London and New York had entirely digested the European tech acquisition, and moved on to the next billion-dollar bloodbath. But for the two individuals who had briefly mistaken a titan for a subordinate, the nightmare had crystallized into a permanent, inescapable reality. Harrington sat in the corner booth of a dingy, linoleum-floored diner off a highway in New Jersey, staring into a mug of lukewarm, bitter coffee. His custom-tailored suits had been sold to a high-end consignment shop to pay his mounting legal fees. He was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting button-down shirt that chafed at his neck. Following his immediate termination from Vanguard Global Logistics, Harrington had discovered the true meaning of a corporate blacklist. In the highly networked, gossip-fueled world of supply chain management, nobody wanted to hire the executive who had publicly insulted and precipitated the assault of a multi-billionaire private equity magnate. His resume, once a golden ticket to six-figure salaries and executive perks, was now completely toxic. His wife, utterly humiliated by the scandal and terrified by the sudden catastrophic loss of their income, had filed for divorce, taking their home in Connecticut and full custody of their children. Harrington was currently living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment above a noisy auto repair shop, spending his days submitting applications for shift manager positions at regional trucking depots jobs that paid a fraction of his former bonus structure. He unrolled the morning edition of the Financial Times. There on page 3 was a high-resolution photograph of Charlotte Hawthorne. She was standing next to the mayor of New York, cutting the ribbon on a massive $200 million philanthropic initiative her firm had fully funded to provide advanced computer science education to underprivileged youth. She looked radiant, powerful, and completely untouchable. Harrington crumpled the newspaper, a bitter, agonizing knot twisting in his stomach. He had possessed a ticket to the top of the world, and he had burned it just to feel superior for 5 minutes. Across the Atlantic, in the dreary, rain-soaked outskirts of a small industrial town in northern England, Barbara Roberts was experiencing her own brand of poetic devastation. She had pleaded guilty to criminal battery to avoid a lengthy, highly publicized trial that she could not possibly afford. The British magistrate, disgusted by her abuse of authority and the unprovoked nature of the attack, had sentenced her to 200 hours of grueling community service and a suspended prison sentence immediately followed by deportation back to the United States. However, her true punishment was her absolute banishment from the skies. The FAA had revoked her flight attendant certification permanently. No commercial airline, let alone a private charter management company, would ever let her near an aircraft again. Barbara was currently wearing a stiff, scratchy polyester uniform in a shade of violently bright orange. She was standing behind the plexiglass counter of a run-down interstate bus terminal in Ohio, processing tickets for exhausted, irritable travelers. A man in a stained T-shirt slammed a fistful of crumpled dollar bills onto her counter, demanding a window seat on the red-eye to Detroit. "There are no assigned seats on the bus, sir," Barbara muttered, her voice devoid of the musical, obsequious tone she used to reserve for Russian oligarchs and Wall Street bankers. "Well, figure it out," the man snapped, grabbing his ticket and storming away. Barbara stared blankly at the stained linoleum floor. The heavy scent of diesel fumes and stale fast food permeated the air, a nauseating contrast to the scent of polished mahogany, fresh orchids, and expensive leather she used to breathe. She closed her eyes, and for a fleeting, agonizing second, she could feel the plush wool carpet of the Gulf Stream beneath her feet. Then she opened her eyes, the stark fluorescent lights of the bus terminal burning away the memory. She had built her entire identity around serving the elite, only to learn that in their eyes she was just as disposable as the people she now served. Back at Teterboro Airport, a familiar scene was unfolding on the pristine, flood-lit tarmac. The sleek, aerodynamic, $65 million Gulfstream G800 sat waiting its twin engines humming with quiet, coiled power. A black SUV pulled up to the airstairs. The rear door opened, and Charlotte Hawthorne stepped out. She had just finished another grueling 48-hour marathon of negotiations in Manhattan. She was exhausted, her shoulders aching from tension. She was dressed in her signature travel attire, a pair of comfortable faded Yale sweatpants, an oversized grey hoodie, and scuffed white sneakers. Her natural hair was pulled back into a messy puff, and her battered canvas backpack hung over one shoulder. She walked up the airstairs, stepping into the brightly lit galley. Standing there, hands clasped respectfully behind his back, was a sharply dressed, impeccably groomed young man in a pristine Apex Aviation uniform. He had a brilliant, genuine smile on his face. He possessed a master's degree in hospitality, spoke 4 languages fluently, and most importantly knew exactly who owned the ground he was standing on. "Good evening, Miss Hawthorne," the flight attendant said, warmly dipping his head in a flawless display of professional respect. "Welcome back to your aircraft. Your stateroom is completely prepared. The blackout panels are secured, and the cabin temperature is set exactly to your preferred profile. May I take your backpack?" Charlotte stopped. She looked at the young man, then glanced down the aisle toward the luxurious main cabin, entirely empty and perfectly quiet. A tiny, imperceptible smirk touched the corner of her lips. "Thank you, David," Charlotte said, her voice smooth and relaxed. She handed him the heavy backpack. "I won't be needing anything else for this flight. Just absolute peace." "Of course, Ma'am. Have a wonderful rest," David replied, stepping aside to give her unfettered access to her jet. Charlotte walked down the plush wool carpet, bypassing the forward lounge area entirely. She slid open the heavy mahogany doors, stepped into her private custom-designed stateroom, and closed the doors behind her, sealing out the rest of the world. Money whispers, but true power, when finally wielded, commands absolute, uninterrupted silence. If you found yourself entirely captivated by this intense story of corporate revenge and poetic justice, do not forget to hit that like button to support the channel. We bring you high-stakes, real-world drama and satisfying karma stories every single week. Share this video with someone who loves seeing arrogant people get exactly what they deserve, and make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our next deep dive into the hidden lives of the ultra-wealthy.